Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on one of the most rigorously secured computing environments detailed in the source material, the RA Sandbox. This architecture is really defined by its core principle, absolute isolation. So we're looking at a system built not just with layers of defense, but with defenses rooted in, well, fundamental physics.
And that combination of physical barriers and pretty profound digital power creates a fascinating intellectual challenge. We are examining a system engineered for environments of, extreme risk, an environment where powerful, self-improving automation, namely the Achilles Discovery Engine and the Vulkan Exploit Forge, operates completely closed off from the world.
Absolute isolation and its ultimate integrity rest primarily on the external, physical, and hardware-enforced boundaries, the fortress elements, if you will, of the Ares sandbox. Or does the true integrity rely on the internal, programmatic, and ethical constraints mandated by the Chimera Covenant and the code that governs the powerful tools operating within that safe space?
Right. And I contend that while the physical isolation is, well, obviously the necessary precondition, the security and, let's say, the long-term trustworthiness of this operation ultimately depend on the code-level governance that prevents internal misuse and ensures accountability for the extremely sensitive work being performed inside.
And I maintain that the physical architecture is the foundational security measure. My position is that if the outer shell, built on the certainty of physics, fails, then the integrity constraints coded into the software environment, well, they become meaningless. Isolation has to be absolute, and that requires physical guarantees. So my thesis is pretty straightforward. Absolute isolation is fundamentally achieved by the Ares Sandbox's physical architecture, which serves as the paramount security measure against external compromise. You simply cannot breach a boundary that doesn't exist in the digital realm. The material is absolutely clear that the physical air gap is the single most critical feature, providing a, quote, complete defense against remote cyber attacks. This isn't just a strong firewall. This is an absolute physical cessation of network connectivity, offering a guarantee based on physics.
That level of physical isolation is certainly impressive. I grant you that. But let me offer maybe a different perspective. Physical isolation is sure a prerequisite for security, but it's not the definition of integrity itself. The system is designed specifically for a high-threat scenario where internal tools, Achilles and Vulkan, are built to discover and generate vulnerabilities and exploits. The inherent risk here isn't just an outside attack getting in, but the catastrophic misuse or, accidental release of the powerful tools inside the box.
I understand the internal risk, but let's look at how the physical barrier is maintained. Even against sophisticated ingress points, we really have to look at the boundary control, the hardware data diode. This isn't just a concept, it's a critical piece of hardware engineering for the data ingress pathway. It physically enforces a unidirectional data flow. Think of it like a one-way valve, basically. Data can only be written into the sandbox, never read back out through that specific channel. This is often achieved using things like fiber optics separated by a physical gap and light sensors, making data exfiltration literally impossible through that dedicated input mechanism. This engineering choice completely neutralizes the most sophisticated air-gap covert channels, things like acoustic, thermal, or optical signals that rely on even the smallest two-way communication. My reliance here is on physics, not complex code trustworthiness.
Okay, I acknowledge the rigor of the hardware data diode, its impressive engineering, but I'd frame the primary defense differently, by emphasizing the security from within. If we accept that the single authorized ingress point is removable media, let's say a USB drive, then the greatest security risk is that someone introduces unauthorized or tampered code via that vector, right? This is why I argue the ultimate integrity rests on the Chimera Covenant as code. Enforced your components like the custom signed UEFI bootloader. The sources actually describe this bootloader as the ultimate safeguard. Now, why? Because it cryptographically verifies the signature of the operating system and all key tools, Achilles, Vulkan, Hephaestus, before they are allowed to execute. It ensures that no unauthorized or malicious code can run, maintaining the isolation right from the moment the system powers on.
Furthermore, the ethical constraint isn't just some policy document.
It's actually code. The Achilles module operates under whitelist-based targeting, which is a programmatic enforcement that prevents the analysis engine from being pointed at any target that hasn't been cryptographically approved and hashed into the system. This digital governance is what prevents internal capability from becoming an internal threat.
Okay, I'm ready to address this definition of the ultimate safeguard. I grant you that the integrity of the boot process is, well, essential, obviously. But if we have to prioritize the isolation aspect, the physical air gap and the definitive function of the data diode provide the absolute defense. The data diode guarantees that no unauthorized signal can leave the system through the input channel. Once the external threat of remote exfiltration is absolutely neutralized by this physical separation, how can any failure of the internal software integrity compromise the system externally? The threat is effectively contained.
That's an interesting point, though. It relies on maybe a very narrow definition of compromise. The material refers to the custom-signed UEFI bootloader as the ultimate safeguard specifically because it defends against the introduction of malicious code, which seems to be considered the most likely vector of high-level compromise for an isolated machine like this. I mean, if the hardware boundary was truly the final, definitive safeguard, why would the documentation prioritize a software constraint that verifies code integrity? This hierarchy suggests that the greatest perceived risk is a failure of internal integrity, that unauthorized actors or perhaps compromised removable media could introduce a persistent threat. The secure boot process ensures isolation is maintained from the very first instruction executed, paramount to ensuring that the work done inside the fortress is trustworthy and, frankly, non-malicious. You seem to be prioritizing the external wall, but the source material appears to emphasize the purity of the environment inside that wall.
But that purity is conditional on the software remaining uncompromised while it's running. The UEFI bootloader only addresses integrity at boot time. It doesn't govern the data flow itself after the system is fully operational. And this brings us directly to the difference between controlling data flow and controlling sensitive output.
And that is exactly where the Covenant shines. Let's look at the output. The most sensitive products generated by this system are not just, data logs, but actual proof of concept exploits developed by the Vulcan Forge and raw vulnerability data discovered by Achilles. The core mission creates the threat, right? So why would the physical isolation be the primary security measure when the entire operation relies on housing and managing extremely sensitive zero-day knowledge?
The critical security mechanism here, I think, is the immediate security applied to those findings. The immediate serialization and encryption of all findings using the Research IL's public key. This mechanism transforms sensitive raw data into encrypted, sort of non-functional output that is useless without the appropriate cryptographic key held by the research authority.
This ensures that the sensitive output cannot be immediately accessed or exploited, even if the internal execution environment were momentarily bypassed or, say, a physical drive were physically captured inside the sandbox.
I'm not entirely convinced that software-based encryption provides the ultimate defense, because it is inherently reliant on the execution of code. If the physical controls are circumvented somehow, software encryption is just insufficient. Consider the threat model we're guarding against. We're talking state-level actors using subtle, non-network covert channels. If the data diode is somehow compromised or if an attacker utilizes the infrastructure, say through power emissions, the encryption keys themselves could theoretically be extracted by sophisticated means. The fact that the system goes to the extraordinary effort of implementing power line protection using specialized line conditioners and UPS systems to filter out noise shows they acknowledge that digital data can exfiltrate via physical means. But by contrast, the data diode, acting as a physical valve on the ingress channel, provides a zero-trust, absolute guarantee of one-way flow. It physically blocks the transmission path necessary for those highly complex physics-based exfiltration methods to work. The physical enforcement is an absolute defense. Cryptography, well, it's still a relative defense that depends on the strength of the algorithm and the secrecy of the key.
While I appreciate the physical barrier of the data diode, the system already protects against power line exfiltration through the redundant physical filtering you just mentioned, right? This shows the system design acknowledges the limits of maybe just the data diode alone and adds layers of active protection. But let's return to the integrity of the output. The cryptographic control ensures that even if a physical device is captured inside the sandbox, the data is encrypted and immediately serialized. This ensures that the only way to process that information is through proper cryptographic authorization tied to the Immutable Audit Ledger, IAL. This means the data itself remains isolated and unusable without external audible authorization, making the cryptographic step the most decisive factor in protecting the mission-critical output.
Okay, we seem to agree that prevention is key, but my concern is that your reliance on accountability structures kind of shifts the focus from hard prevention to reaction, which brings us to accountability versus foundational security.
I guess I come at it from a different way. When you're dealing with tools as powerful as Achilles, an engine capable of automated vulnerability discovery, the potential for accidental or worse, malicious misuse is a massive operational risk that has to be addressed proactively, not just ethically. That is why the Chimera Covenant mandate requires mandatory transparency and accountability enforced as code. And this is not just logging for ethics. The enhanced tracer core on the Achilles module logs every single decision and code path taken during its analysis. This comprehensive auditable record is then stored on the Immutable Audit Ledger, IAL. The keyword there is immutable. This means the record cannot be tampered with or erased, even by root users on the system. This infrastructure is a fundamental security safeguard against internal threats because it ensures total traceability and prevents the rogue use of the powerful analysis tools.
But security is fundamentally about prevention. Removing wireless components via hardware neutralization is prevention. The physical fortress provides a definitive barrier. Accountability, while certainly important for ethics and governance, is inherently a reactive measure. It's logging what happened after the fact, maybe confirming the damage, and hopefully tracing the actor.
Within this unique environment, the accountability structure is preventative in a way. The whitelist-based targeting is a perfect example. It's a code-level constraint that literally prevents the Achilles module from directing its massive capability at any target that hasn't been cryptographically approved. It's like an internal fence around the most dangerous component. Without this covenant as code, the powerful capability housed within the fortress is essentially ungoverned. The traceability and the whitelist targeting are integral safeguards against what might be the primary remaining threat vector, the authorized but perhaps compromised internal actor. Without this system of digital governance, the project itself becomes, frankly, too risky, regardless of how high the physical walls are built.
I acknowledge that the internal governance provided by the Chimera Covenant, especially the whitelist-based targeting and the IAL, is a crucial internal safeguard against operational misuse. But let's return to the term absolute isolation. That term fundamentally refers to preventing unauthorized access or data exfiltration from the controlled environment. That function is uniquely and, I'd argue, absolutely guaranteed by the physical boundary, the air gap, the dedicated facility, and the hardware data diode. These components define the Tier 0 environment and provide a complete defense against remote threats, a defense that no amount of code checking can replicate if the physical hardware itself is somehow compromised.
Its whole purpose is to run powerful closed-loop automation inside that boundary. The integrity of that operational mission, which creates the zero-day knowledge, is the real long-term security challenge here. And that integrity is upheld by the code-level safeguards. The custom signed UEFI bootloader prevents any unauthorized code from running at the most fundamental level. The whitelist-based targeting prevents the Achilles engine from being directed externally or inappropriately. And the rigorous auditing mechanism via the Immutable Audit Ledger maintains the system's ethical and operational mission under the Chimera Covenant.
Ultimately, the multi-layer defense is what makes the Era sandbox so robust. However, the operational definition of a Tier 0 secure environment really hinges on the physical boundary, the air gap, the dedicated facility, and the hardware data diode, which provide a complete, absolute defense against remote exfiltration and define the outer perimeter. Everything else protects the integrity and the ethical execution of the work inside the isolation.
Right, and everything else ensures that the work inside the isolation is operationally sound and fundamentally controlled, preventing the powerful tools from becoming an internal, potentially catastrophic threat. The material clearly shows the necessity of both the physical fortress and the rigorous digital governance, leaving us, I think, to weigh whether external prevention through physics or internal integrity through code is the more decisive factor in maintaining true absolute isolation.